And I hope for the next hour or so that I'll keep you entertained with a few colourful slides and introduce you a little bit into what I call the Achaemenid-Hellenistic Transition in Egypt. The slide that you see up here is an oil painting currently in the Louvre, painted by Adrien Guignet, and it depicts Cambyses and Psammetichus III at 525 BC. This is where we'll start. Now, this is an Orientalist fantasy, obviously, with the ubiquitous pyramids and elephants and an obelisk thrown in and a tomb in the back. With the Memnon Colossi, and then for at least an Egyptologist's point of view, an exotic king slightly off-center under the parasol, and that's Cambyses. And in front of him, seated with his back towards him, you see a king with the double crown on his head, seated rather defeated and dejected, and he had every right to be a bit upset. Because he was promptly executed by Cambyses together with the upper echelons of his court. So 525, it's a momentous occasion in Egyptian history. It's not the first time, though, that foreign armies have set foot on Egyptian soil. The first time was only 100 years before that with the Neo-Assyrians and the Neo-Babylonians who sacked Thebes. That was an important town in the south of Egypt, which I'll show you in a little bit, and they left a nominally loyal vassal in their wake, one of the main princes of the sort of chiefdoms that was Egypt at this time, and Psammetichus I, so the vassal that they left in their wake, was a skilled and consummate diplomat and quickly amalgamated all power in Egypt, and then set about making up his royal aura to the rest of the Eastern Mediterranean. Let me put it at that. And then by the second half of the 6th century, there's a wave of Persians coming from the east. And I've given you here this situation as it is topographically. They're coming from the east, and then they turn immediately to in the second half of the 6th century to Egypt, which is the Eastern Mediterranean's grain basket and therefore agricultural powerhouse at the time. So in 525 they conquer Egypt, and then they turn and set their sights a lot more further north. One of Cambyses' successors, Xerxes, turns towards northwestern Greece, and by the 490s he's up there. Presumably here, there's another picture of Guignet here, with Xerxes presumably contemplating his military strategy right at the Hellespont. Now, because I know that I'm talking for quite a mixed audience tonight, I'll just put up I thought I'd put up some of the key dates here. So 664 BC is the start of the 26th dynasty. It's also the time that Thebes was sacked. But Psammetichus I didn't waste much time in getting rid of any Assyrian remnants in Egypt. This started an Egyptian renaissance of about 150 years until 525, when the Persians arrived on the scene. And this is what Egyptologists call the start of the first Persian domination. This lasted for a bit more than 100 years, as you can see. By 404, Egypt was independent again, and there was a rapid succession of what Egyptologists call dynasties, so the 28th, 29th, 30th dynasties. And these are families or houses situated across Egypt that were sometimes warring with each other and deposing, in the case quite rapidly here. And then there's, at 343 BC, there's a little bit more than a decade of a second Persian domination, which is an altogether harsher affair than the first one. And then by the time Alexander III, or Alexander the Great, arrives, he's greeted as a liberator, and he continues in the remainder of his life to sweep the Persians off the world stage. And by 305, Ptolemy, one of his successors, is crowned in Memphis as the new king of Egypt. And the Achaemenid-Hellenistic Transition that I'll focus on tonight is this roughly century of independence and a little bit of Persian domination as well. A lot of scholarship has focused on either the earlier periods or the Ptolemaic period, but in the last 5 to 7 years, there's been a lot of new scholarship. There are two exceptions, though. The bottom left one, the book of Naucratis by Professor Müller, was published in 2000, and the one at the bottom right, Money in Ptolemaic Egypt, was published in 2007. And these are both seminal studies, but have suffered from the fact that there have been a lot of development since. So Money in Ptolemaic Egypt is still the go-to book, but you need to then also use the French publication that I've showed you up there from 2012 with the new interpretation and series of the Ptolemaic coinage. A few weeks ago we had Professor Bresson here, who's really rewritten ancient Greek economy and is, I think, one of the drivers of the field at the moment. Trouble in the West is a book by an ancient historian, an American ancient historian, who's really filled a gap in Egyptian historiography, filling in, really dealing quite skillfully with both the Greek and the Persian sources, but reframing the whole conflict between the Greeks and the Persians as one between Egypt and Persia, where Greece is more of an extended consequence than anything else. The book by Brian Muse from Chicago came out this year, is an important new handbook for the ancient Egyptian economy, really the first, and has a detailed, thorough description of all the institutions, and takes a very long-term view of the Egyptian economy, and in its wealth of detail is very important for the field to move on, for Egypt at least. And then I've put another outlier in there, Mrs. Senhor. I'll talk a little bit more about that, but this makes the papyrological evidence from around the time that I'll be talking about a little bit earlier far more accessible and for a wider audience, even beyond Egyptologists. And then the final two publications are ones that I've been involved in myself in my previous position as a PhD student, and Thomas Herakli on the excavations there, which I'll also talk about briefly. But since 2000, there have been ongoing archaeological excavations there, which has really rewritten the relationship between Greece and Egypt and Naucratis to a large extent. But this has also had implications for the century in between, just before the arrival of Alexander the Great. And part of the problem when dealing with Egyptian economic history is, especially for the first millennium, is the dichotomy in the archaeological record in Egypt. When you think about the Egyptian archaeology, you think about perhaps pyramids, perhaps the tomb of Tutankhamun, perhaps the big temples, as the one I've put up on the top right, Medinet Habu in Thebes. But the political and economic emphasis in Egypt really shifts towards the Nile Delta in the first millennium BC, and so anything that comes from the Nile Valley is fairly, I hate to say it, provincial compared to what's happening really in the Delta. However, the papyrological evidence that's often cited for the Ptolemaic and Roman periods, there's also earlier material. And the Dutch scholar, specialist on cursive scripts, Koen Donker van Heel, has recently, in 2013 and 15, published these two books, Jechi and Son and Mrs. Senhor, where he deals with the abnormal hieratic and early demotic archives of the Coachites, or caretakers of mummies in Thebes, and I've circled that here on the map. Now, I'll take Mrs. Senhor as an example. This is a lady of the lower middle classes who was born around 550 and died presumably shortly or soon after 490, but that's unclear. We have her archive, or the archive of her daughter, that contained a lot of her contracts. And she is seen to be very independent. She conducts her own business. She buys slaves. She buys houses with her second husband. She makes sure that her son and living daughter all get equal shares in the inheritance. And she really gives us a glimpse into a life of working class, middle class people that we don't necessarily get from anywhere in the Delta. There's another community around Memphis, but we really see that, and taken together over a few hundred years, Donker van Hill really builds up a picture of very entrepreneurial people who take care of maybe 100 mummies, or at least tens of mummies, that they have to go and visit every week. It's a 10-day work week. And they go and check with the chef, and there's a whole economic system that we wouldn't know anything about were it not for these cursive script archives that he's presented beautifully here. The reason that I put Medinet Habu up here is because presumably she would have worked in the neighborhood, and you see around the edge here the big enclosure wall. And within that wall, this is something that happens in the first millennium. You get these huge enclosure walls around the temples, and within there people start to live. And then once every century or two, that gets cleared out and the whole process starts again. And so these become villages in and by of itself, and this continues into the Coptic period. Sources in the north are a lot more scanty. I've highlighted here Herodotus, of course, who is a valuable resource he visited Egypt in the 5th century. We often don't quite know how accurate he is. Often, if we are unsure, then we think that he's embellished. But there's also evidence, for example, from Thonis Heraclion in the boat building that actually he was quite accurate. But he has a tendency, like a modern journalist, to embellish his sources. But he's an important source of Greek, and we have reliefs, for example, this one now in the British Museum from Nineveh, where you see one of these enclosure walls being scaled by the Neo-Assyrians. If we actually look at the archaeological record in the Delta, I've given you the capital of the 26th dynasty, one that Herodotus describes. I've given you the reconstruction here at the bottom. Something's wrong here in the screen anyway. I've given you the reconstruction and then the modern day overview, where it's now more or less a pit. There's absolutely nothing left at the site. Unfortunately, in the 19th century, farmers would dig these mounds, because there were mounds of mud brick, to use as fertilizer. The mud brick contains a lot of organic material. And in that way, a lot of the archaeology of the Delta has been destroyed. The other complicating factor is that because of the high pressure, and both from population and agricultural pressure, we can't actually excavate modern-day settlements. And if it's under fields, if we even get permission to work there, there's a high water table, which obviously gets rid of any organic remains, but it also makes any work quite expensive. Obviously, this has changed somewhat with new survey methods in the last 2 decades or so. The other site that I want to mention here is Naucratis, which is in the western part of the Delta near the Wadi Natrum. Naucratis was known from antiquity as the place where the Greeks went and settled in Egypt. And the father of British archaeology, Professor William Flinders Petrie, up here, was particularly interested in general in Egypt, but in 1885 he went to Egypt specifically to find Naucratis, which he did, and he published, but his excavations were funded by the Egypt Exploration Fund, and this was a fund where you subscribe to, so you give money, and then part of the deal is that you get something in return. So what he excavated, he brought back home, he published very quickly, usually within a few years, and then the material was dispersed. And one of the interesting, I think, new projects started in 2011 is that the British Museum first did an archival work and is now still in the process of collecting all this material and putting it back together. But it also has started new fieldwork. And part of this fieldwork is where they've identified original stratigraphy. And one of the key results is these two pie charts that I've put up, where on the left there is the early fieldwork from Petrie, which shows an enormous, an overwhelming majority of Greek pottery, whereas if you look at the original stratigraphy at the site, it's more or less the other way around. There's far more of an Egyptian presence and far smaller Greek, Levantine and Cypriot material. The other main difference now from the 2000 publication by Professor Müller is that it's beyond doubt now that there was also a Saite temple at the site. So the idea in a lot of classical archaeologists' minds that following Herodotus, that Naucratis was a Greek emporion, a Polyanian port of trade, with no Egyptians present is not true anymore. And how this exactly works with the new fieldwork in Thonis Heraklion remains to be seen and is presumably a relationship. They both are on the same branch of the Nile that changes over time. The earliest ceramics, I should say, from both Naucratis and Thonis Heraklion are from the final quarter of the 7th century, which is the same time as Psamtik I, who I mentioned right at the start of the Saite dynasty. So this is all part of the same, starts at the same time. Now there's also a problem with identifying Greeks in the archaeological record. I've put some coffins and one statue up here. The coffin on the left, the sarcophagus on the left, is by from a man called Wachebre Achet. It's in Leiden at the moment. It's 6th century, and by all intents and purposes, it's 6th century. It's perfectly normal. It looks completely Egyptian. But until you read the names of his father and mother, who are Greek, so this is actually a second-generation immigrant. So it's very difficult to really quantify anything in terms of the presence in Egypt of the Greeks, what they were doing, and what kind of economic activities, if the Greeks disappear in the record like they do, as this, for example, shows. Two slightly later examples from Abu Sir, both found in a shaft tomb by the Czech Institute in the late 90s, and Uja Horesnet in the early 80s and 90s. These are two officials from around the time of the Persian conquest in Egypt. Eupha was 25 to 35 years old when he died, and these shaft tombs are about 8 by 10 meters and 30 meters deep. Eupha was found intact, so you get an idea of what a kind of burial this would have looked like. But it's Uja Horesnet here on the, they were neighbors, Eupha and Uja Horesnet is the one I'm interested in, and he has, he's been portrayed in the literature as a collaborator with the Persians, and it's unclear what exactly is going on. He's a general. He was responsible for the Greek mercenaries at the time. He seems to have fallen out of favor with Amasis, one of the long-reigning final pharaohs of the 26th dynasty. But what exactly happens is unclear. He might have been out of favor by the time Cambyses arrives, but he's a doctor and he used to command soldiers. And when Cambyses arrives, he takes care of giving the new Persian king Egyptian titulatory, which is important in terms of religious overtones, and it seems that he even travels to Persia. So the Persians, the Sayids already start with reforming both the army and the administration, and it seems that what the Persians do very well is they keep everything in place, but they put on top a Persian boss, as it were. And they take talent as they see it here in Ujaharesnet, and they use it to their own advantage. Now, part of what I'll be talking about is the monetary or metrological landscape, and in this transitional period, this 100 years between the end of the Persian period and the start of the Ptolemaic period. And just to put the contrast sharply, Ptolemy, the first and second, this is from Sita von Raden's work that I showed you, they really push through quite energetically monetary reforms. So we see that all of a sudden the temple monopoly that was still in place is replaced by a state monopoly, which and there's a whole tax farming system that's now implemented. So the main innovation there is that the institutions now support a fully monetized economy. This is both in precious metal coinage and in the fiduciary bronze coinages that I show you here. Obviously, there's the founding of Alexandria, which becomes the place of the new mint, the royal mint, and the old temples, and this is an image from the 19th century of Edfu, the temple monopoly, that I'll talk about a bit more next. Also, they are sidelined at this point. So what about this Achaemenid-Hellenistic transition? What happened? I started a little bit early, about a decade earlier than the actual independence of Egypt from the Persians, because by 415 there are renewed hostilities between Greece and Persia. And delta chiefdoms, remnants of the previous princedoms that we've seen, seek their chances and start building up their power bases. What I've tried to, where is my cursor? Tried to show you here is some of the foreign influence developments that you see over this century. So there's a bit of a build-up. And then at the top, what I show you is where Persians are back on Egyptian soil. So it's political and economic change, because the 4th century is politically an incredibly volatile period, with the Egyptians on the one hand frantically trying to conserve their independence and trying to establish alliances with the various Greek states. And then in the meantime, there are the Persians who see their breadbasket and economic tributes significantly reduced, and they're very keen on getting the province back. So by 405 there's independence, then there's one king of the 28th dynasty, he's killed off or usurped 29th dynasty, and for the first time there are Persians back on Egyptian soil. They're repelled. Again, a lot of what we know about all these invasions, we don't know much archaeologically at all. It's the classical authors where we can reconstruct some of the developments from. Again, in 373 and then 350, there's a whole gap there where there's a continuous threat, but the Persians never quite make it to assemble the army and invade. So in summary, I've put it up here again. There's a significant increase in foreign influence just before 380 and around the 360 mark, and we'll come back to that in just a minute. And if we then, because my focus is on the metrological landscape, if you were, my research, I'm giving you an overview of a lot of new work that's been going on and the way that we can build up a picture of the 4th century. And what I work on specifically is not on the texts, which is what everybody else does, but I work on the weights and metal objects and what I've called the metrological landscape in Egypt at this time. So I've given you an overview here where I've plotted some of the coin types that appear in the 4th century. So in the preceding period there's a lot of Athenian tetradrams, and what you see happening at the start of the 4th century is the appearance of unmarked, to all intents and purposes bona fide, Athenian tetradrams, and these are called butchery types for the numismatist who identified them. And they all seem to, the hoards where we find them all close in around the first 2 decades of the 4th century. And then what happens is that there are 2 further precious metal, so gold coinages. There's the single coin here at the bottom in the British Museum, which on the reverse next to the owl that you see shows the Greek letters T, tau, alpha, omega, which has been interpreted as the Egyptian pharaoh Tachos, or Taos. And then the other one is only the reverse is showing there. Also a gold coinage, slightly. This is the Taos coinage is one single coin, so we can't say very much about it. And then the Nebu Nefer, so the Egyptian hieroglyphic signs on the back say good gold, and this is a coinage of about 50 coins, 47. And both of them are on a Persian weight standard, so a gold darik of 8.3. And the other unmarked imitation coinages from Athens are on the Athenian weight standard. So the first appearance of coinage, in Egypt you would have a lot of silver exchange already much earlier in the first millennium, and the presence of a proto-coinage. But the actual appearance of coinage in itself, they're treated as bullion, and I'll show you that in the next slide. Then for the Second Persian domination, there is the Artaxerxes III with Aramaic legends that are struck, and some of the Persian satraps. Now, what does this all mean? In the Egyptian abnormal hieratic and early demotic documents, there are already references to temples, so silver of the temple. First, silver of Arsaphis, which is the temple of Heracleopolis, one of these important smaller chiefdoms in Egypt. This then, from the abnormal hieratic to the early demotic, changes to the treasury of Thebes, and then to the treasury of Tach. And this treasury and connotation continues right through until, I think, the latest mention is in the Roman period. And there have been various interpretations of what exactly silver of the treasury actually means. Does it mean any marked silver bullion? Does it mean silver of a certain purity? Or does it mean that weights are checked against, as it were, royal weights held in the temple itself? But what it does mean is that there is a certain standardization. Now, the only other document that we have it's a customs account. It's Aramaic, and it dates from around 475 BCE. This is the only customs account that we have in antiquity, I believe. And it measures, or it accounts for both Ionian ships and Levantine ships that come in. It's dated to year 11 of a Persian king, which on the basis of paleography and year numbers must be Xerxes I, so hence 475. And Peter van Alphen, the foremost expert on Athenian owls and tetradrams, has recently written a study on this, a renewed look at this Aramaic papyrus, and he's argued that in fact what is happening here, and I'll show you in silver, there's in the Persian weight system, there's a very odd fractional amounts listed for each boat that comes in. So you have Ionian boats, large and small, and then Levantine boats, large and small. And the Levantine boats, remember that this is a Persian province at the time, pay a much lower tax rate than the foreign Ionian ships. And these come presumably from Phasaelis, which was on the Turkish coast, what I showed you on the second slide. He's argued that, in fact, the notational system here is the Persian standard, the Persian weight standard, but in fact, that what seems to be happening is that they are targeting the Attic tetradrachm. So if you convert the amounts back to Athenian, on the Athenian standard, you get quite even numbers if you calculate them to tetradrachms. So it seems that in the 5th century already, the Persian state, in Egypt at least, is targeting specific bullion to be paid as taxes. And when do we see this start to appear in Egyptian sources? And that's only really at the start, at the very end of the 5th century. So around the time that the Delta dynasts are starting to consolidate power, because Persia is busy with warring with Greece. All of a sudden, very much in the provincial, again, in the south, we see two archives. Here on the Nile Valley, it's the Aramaic archive, Elephantine archive, of which the previous erased customs document is a part, and the Demotic ostraca that I show you here in Ein Manouir. These were found here near the blue arrow in the temple. It's an archive of 461 current count of ostraca, and these are potsherds that you see up there. This is the actual one that I'm talking about with the transcription of the Demotic, so you can see what I mean with a cursive script down there at the bottom. And in lines 8 to 9, it says the starter of the treasury of Ptah. So what is this doing in this small town? So this in Ein Manouir is probably occupied from 470 to around 370 BC. It's a small community, farming community, and all of a sudden we have the oldest attestations of this Greek word starter appearing right in the middle of nowhere, basically. And what happens is that you either have starter on its own, and in the oldest attestation that I've shown you just now, it says treasury of Ptah on its own, and this is the only attestation in the whole archive. Or you have a starter and then an equation with the Egyptian weight standard. And in the case of Ein Manouir, it's actually the other way around, that the starter seems to be the first unit mentioned, and then as a way of accounting, presumably, there is an equivalency in the Egyptian weight standard. But as other scholars have already pointed out, there is a discrepancy there of 5 to 4, 5, 6 grams, depending on how accurate the weight standard is, between the two. And I've taken the 5% difference, and this has been interpreted as unimportant because it's glossed over. The fact that there is this discrepancy is then considered, well, if you put them on the balance, and there's a margin of error there. If you have your weights, there's a margin of error there, and quickly that adds up to a 5% difference. Or perhaps this is a premium, and this has been argued before in 2001 on the basis of this. There's also a term called seigneurage, which is the tax that a state would incur or ask when it's minting its own. So you have the costs of the mint, and then on top of that there's an amount of money that perhaps the state might ask as a profit. And it has been, this 5% difference between the Deben and the bullion coin has been argued as perhaps a sign that Egypt is minting its own coinage at this point. The recent scholarship has suggested that this obviously now means a material reality. So even in the furthest province or an outpost of Egypt, you have the reality of a bullion coin appearing in someone's pocket. Now, in the starter, in Greek, in classical scholarship, this means a didrachm, half of a tetradrachm, basically, but because of this equation, the starter in the texts, both in the Aramaic and the Demotic, must imply a tetradrachm. So yes, a quick roundup of the equivalencies and the reference to the Temple of Ptah. The same goes for, there's a striking parallel with the Aramaic papyri that I just showed you, a much older document. This is a more or less contemporaneous, this petition, but I give it to you as an example of what it might look like. And again, the oldest reference in the Aramaic archive of the Elephantine garrison in the southern outpost in Egypt talks about both the stones of Ptah and the stones of the king, and again has a equivalency of 2 shekel to a stater. And the scholar who's published and most extensively on this archive actually argues on the basis of this equivalency that there must be a new Elephantine shekel. So either it's the normal Babylonian shekel or a new Elephantine shekel. Now, I had a look, I've worked a lot on weights, and one of the, but not on the stone weights from Naucratis, which are currently being restudied by a member of the Naucratis team from the British Museum. But the lady who did a PhD on weights in 1989 published this analysis of the stone weights from Naucratis. So these are roughly contemporaneous weights. And the interesting thing that comes out of her analysis here is that there is a distinct peak of weights that can be attributed to the 8.4 Babylonian shekel. There is a minor peak at slightly heavy, perhaps for the 8.7 reconstructed shekel that Bellozel-Portan argued for. But very strikingly, those are only for the weights that weigh fairly are on the lower end of the scale. But if you look at the heavier weights, these show the distinct peak at for the Babylonian shekel, and then a much wider range for the Egyptian Deben Kita standard. But there's absolutely no indication of, well, not a very dominant one anyway, of anything resembling an Elephantine shekel. So on that basis, I think it's very unlikely that there is an exact equivalency in the Aramaic texts, that there's no such thing as the Elephantine shekel, and that, in fact, the difference between these two weights, the 3 weight systems basically, the Athenian tetradrachm, the Deben, and the shekel, is significant. And if I plot that in a sort of graph, not taking into account the slightly wider range of the Deben Kita here, then the Athenian tetradrachm and the Babylonian shekel, you see that the difference between them is 5 to 6%, depending on how accurate your tetradrachm actually is. In practice, it's around 17.2, but the maximum theoretical weight would be 17.4. You always have to account for a little bit of wear and a little bit of undermarking, so that whoever's minting might take the little bit of profit, and it will rarely be a lot heavier, at least in coinage. And then the striking thing is that the Babylonian shekel is actually lighter. Now the parallel that again has been drawn between this discrepancy between the Deben and the tetradrachm is that in Greece there is a similar discrepancy between what is called a market weight standard and the coin weight standard, and there's also a 5% difference there. However, this cannot be taken. So initially, when I first started thinking, I thought actually this means that in Egypt, the Greeks and the Egyptians, clearly they've established a similar ratio between the two. So you have for the bullion, you'll have the Egyptian standard, and then for the actual coined money, it's slightly lower, and that's the premium. However, also in Greece, bullion is weighed by the coin standard, so this doesn't work. But it's intriguing that there is this same percentage both in Greece and in Egypt at the same time. Now, what to do with the Babylonian shekel? needs a bit more work in terms of the coin hoards that I'll come to next. But the 2.5% is still probably too large to be explained by any sort of inaccuracies on both the balance and the coins. And I know that this is, not everybody agrees with me here, but 2% seems is still within reason of what would be distinguished in text. So just the fact that we can't really reconstruct how that would work technically perhaps is more to do with our current state of knowledge more than what we think the ancients were possible of doing. If we then look at popularity of tetradrachms in Egypt, again taken from an article by Peter van Alphen, you see that the classical period, classical one is 480 to 360. Anything before that in the hoards occurs a lot of normal hack silver, so the more an ingot shape than anything else. But in the total of 13 hoards, there are 4 already that contain owls. This is another word for Athenian tetradrachm, because of the reverse shows an owl. But by 480, all hoards in Egypt contain tetradrachms, including some with imitations, which I will come to. So if you look at the distribution of hoards in Egypt, there is, I've put the map up of the whole of Egypt, but they're all concentrated in the north. And then if I map them with the imitations, that also concentrates it even further in the north. Now, what does that mean, an unmarked imitative owl? So I've given you a 5th century owl here, a buttery type imitation, and then a pie style, so mid 4th century and later pie style owl. And you can see that there are certain differences. So the top one is first half of the 4th century, the bottom one, second half of the 4th century. There's differences in the hair ornaments, in the helmet ornaments, in the ear, and in the eye, compared to the 5th century, for example. And the fact that that the first coins in Egypt are presumably Egyptian minted because of the rather crude style, but they don't give any Egyptian iconography. They're purely, to all intents and purposes, they look like an Athenian tetradrachm. And that is an interesting phenomenon that only really with Ptolemy I you start to see something that resembles what we normally associate with coinage, is that it has a social function, a power function as well, to show that this is the royal, the power, exerting power over, and the propaganda that is often associated with coinage. This does not happen here at all. So what exactly, who these coins are minted for is not clear. And what I've done over the summer is look at the weights of these coins to see if there's any adaptation. Now there's on the middle column, there's a publication, I've listed them, where the buttery weights, this imitative coinage that has been identified by the numismatist Buttery, mainly in one Fayum hoard that contains he identified a lot of die links with, and that was the basis of his argument that these must have been minted in Memphis, in the Temple of Ptah. Van Alphen collected all the coins and weighed them, and in the middle column you see that the actual weights of the coins approach this double shekel a lot more. So up until now the thinking has been that imitative coins actually have a drag down towards the Persian standard. However, with the current tally of 2 new unpublished hoards, this is not the case anymore at all. And these resemble normal Athenian tetradrachms very closely. And if I then put some more hoards up there, so the Fayum hoard, is the one I'm talking about with a lot of the buttery types. Then at the top right corner, this is the second half of the pie style, second half 4th century. The Kocheman hoard is a very large unpublished hoard with a lot of imitations, which seems to be an outlier with very much on weight. And then I've also put the Artaxerxes and the Babylonian minted Iraq hoard at the bottom. So there seems to be now 2 parallel developments, that whereas the Egyptian imitative owls are very much on weight, as the Athenian weight standard would be, and anything that is Persian or Babylonian minted, that's where the mint was, seems to show a completely, a rather different development. Now, what about minting then in Egypt? If we have the Temple of Tach, well, we don't know what that looked like. The Temple of Tach, again, not a lot of archaeological evidence. What we do have, though, is a series of coin dies very similar to this one from Thonis Heraklion, which show that there are these square cube coin dies, and these have been interpreted as perhaps not so much the state minting that we might think of in the Temple of Tach with a huge setup, but rather more portable and probably die cutters that travelled through Egypt and then minted at on an ad hoc basis. And perhaps that explains a bit more about the single Tachos coin. Tachos was the pharaoh who really wanted to invade into the Levant, and it's been argued that this gold coinage was used to pay for soldiers, but you risk a bit of a circular argument there. And the other slightly larger gold coinage, again 47 coins, so not very large, and not a large number of dies, which tells you something about the size of the original coinage. And they're also not very much on weight, so they're on the seemingly the Persian standard, but there's quite a wide range. So again, this seems to be more of a bullion coin than anything, and that needed to be weighed every single time, than anything that can be taken at face value. So what and who is being paid with these coins it's not entirely clear. So there's one more coin weight here with the reverse of a pie style owl reverse there with the counter stamp of a ram's head, which is the symbol for Amun, which is the main temple in Thonis Heraklion. What you see here is one of the stelae from the site from 380 BC, so Nectanebo I, first half of the 4th century. I told you I'd show you a few pretty pictures. One of the 65 ships that we found in Thonis Heraklion. The stela deals with the taxation of Nectanebo I, where he reroutes part of the taxation at the customs office to Sais. And this is a reconstruction similar to the one I showed you from Sais, from the same guy, of the topographical environment here. So in the back you see the Nile arm, and then in the centre, the temple, and a lot of the waterways and harbour areas. We don't know very much about the size of the settlement itself. A lot of the mud brick underwater washes away, so we can't really tell very much. As I mentioned, a lot of the 65 or 67 in the meantime shipwrecks have been found, and then in the red square a little bit to the south of that we found an Egyptian temple of the 4th century where this stela comes from, together with the Naus, which tells us that it's Amun of Gereb, and taken together we know that they were found in situ. Now a lot of the weights from here, one of them I've already showed you. I've broken them down. There's 26 Greek-style weights, 92 uninscribed Greek-style weights, and then only, again, a minority of the original Egyptian. And if I plot them across the sites, there's a rather random scatter, it seems, and not very helpful. If I pull them out, the Egyptian so-called cupcake weights all occur in the northern area, which is in the pottery that we find, the older area. And then around the temple, there's what I've called here Egyptian domed shape. So you miss a little bit of that edge that you see in the end. But these don't, again, I think are probably more on a Levantine standard, and I can't identify that yet. So there seems to be a topographical divide, but then if I look at the datable ones, so the complication with these Egyptian styles, they're not inscribed. I can't distinguish between late period and Ptolemaic period. So while these are interesting, they don't tell me anything by and in itself of dating. And the only ones that do are these Greek-style weights, and these are all made of lead. And these have symbols on them and letters, and they tell me by the symbol what kind of fraction on the standard it would have been, and the lettering tells me something, either also something about the fraction or about the state that issued these. And the demo that you can read on there refers to Amun in this. Refers to Athens in this case. When I first saw these, I thought that's interesting. I hadn't seen any of this topographical divide yet, but I thought that's interesting because it will tell me something about the exchange that was taking place. Until I mapped them, and they turned out to be in the water. So instead, what this shows us, this is in a context with a lot of cultic activity. So there's no amphory or anything like that. They're all fine ware, probably associated with drinking, and bronze ritual equipment. Presumably this shows that an Athenian merchant arrived in Egypt, had a safe journey or perhaps a hazardous one, and was glad to have arrived in Egypt, and as a votive offering left these Athenian weights in the water, which is what a lot of the other objects have been interpreted as votive offerings as well. However, the weights, why I'm bringing them up, they can tell me something about dating, because there are a lot of Greek similar weights that are from dated contexts in Athens, etc., and Olympia. And the weight standards that have been reconstructed, the only one that we understand well is this Attic one. So again, we look at the symbols on them and on the lettering, and then I've put the 6 weights from the site that we have. And then if you use the symbols and the letters, you can reconstruct the system, which I think, or in my opinion, is the 112 drachma per mina. Mina is the unit. It's roughly half a kilo, but it becomes ever so slightly heavier every, say, a century. I'm simplifying slightly. So initially it was 105 drachma. This is the market weight mina. Then it goes up to 112, 138, and then finally 150, so that it equates very nicely with the Roman pound. If I then reconstruct the original mina from the fraction, there are 2 outliers in the middle, the dolphin, but as you can see, it's very worn, and I need to account for that as well. But on the whole, the lead weights being underwater just develops a thin layer of oxidization, and it seems that even the lead weights are fairly close on weight. There's not a lot of inaccuracy present there at all. So just to give you a few more of these examples, these are the heavier ones. So the top 2 in this list. The tortoise, and then the half tortoise, and then for comparison, a smaller. But these are roughly the same. The top 2 and the Egyptian one are roughly the same on the same scale. So what this shows us is that there was quite a significant, if I go back to, that there is quite a significant presence of Greek weights in Tholos Heracleum. So taken together, these are the final ones that I want to show you. These are ones that I can't quite attribute. So it's not, I'm showing you the nicest and the ones that I got the nicest result with, but this, you quickly walk up against the fact that we don't really know a lot about any other Greek standards. So if we look at these are familiar in terms of amphory and half amphory and even quarter amphory, but if I multiply them out towards the mina, I can't really attribute them to any known system. And this might mean that they're not from Athens, but perhaps associated with Athens, but they're on a different system. So taken all together, to conclude, the 4th century is politically volatile. The Persians knock on Egypt's door on a number of occasions. We can't really assess the economic repercussions for the 4th century because we don't know a lot from Egyptian sources about the actual military expenditure. We don't know a lot apart from the fact that there was a lot of temple building, so a lot of state expenditure throughout the 4th century. But a lot of these temples have been reduced to piles of rubble, so we can't assess the scale of temple building, except that it was in high quality stone, but we can't say very much about size. So there's, in this politically troubled time, there's a lot of military expenditure, state expenditure to contend with, and a lot of temple building. But what we don't know is any of the proxy data that we've talked about at the conference, so we don't know anything about house sizes or economic or agricultural output. What my survey has attempted to show, I hope, is that a lot of the monetary developments form a bridge between or towards the Ptolemaic period. So a lot of it's an impartially monetized economy, but if the stata is a material reality as far away as Ain Manouir, as we've seen, then this must mean that I can't imagine what the material reality of the coinage in the Delta was like in the 4th century in that sense. And it's interesting that the metrological landscape of Egypt in the 4th century shows that there is both a strong Greek or Athenian and a strong Persian influence as well that sort of sits in between the Egyptian Devon and presumably because of its relationship with the Egyptian Devon Kita standards, the owl, it partially explains why the Athenian tetradrachm gained such a popularity in the 4th century. Thank you.